Gentlemen, this is very exciting. We are actually making some progress. We are approaching the end of chapter 1 of Tanya. This all going according to plan, which is a big conditional. But if everything goes according to plan, big if, this will be the second to last class on chapter 1. Next time will be the last class, God willing. If we don't make it at that breakneck speed, that's also okay. The Alter Rebbe is still discussing the nature of the first soul that a Jew has. And we've been discussing the nature of this soul. We've been building it up piece by piece, idea by idea. We began with a discussion saying that the first soul comes from Klippa. The first soul comes from the shell or the peel. It's a shell reality, which means, as we explained at great length in 2 whole classes, please go and review them. If you need review on these concepts, we'll try and keep it fresh, but we can only use so much time. The shell reality, the first soul that comes from the shell or the peel, is essentially the idea of I am. I am is the idea of the first soul. In other words, as we explained, there is no such thing as neutral reality. Good evening. There's no such thing as neutral existence per se. Everything begins with the divine reality. Everything begins with the divine existence. What it means to believe in the God of Abraham, the God of Judaism, is to know that existence is not a given. Existence is not something that just is, ironically. Existence itself means that something just is, perhaps. But existence is not something that itself exists, actually. Right? We believe that God created everything, which means that first nothing existed. And if we've explained previously in this class, and I mentioned it in last week's review as well, that in fact this includes God as well, because God's true existence within himself is not really an existing existence. It's a footnote for those who remember prior and much earlier classes, that God, by the divine nature, in fact, is existence beyond existence, transcends the word existence. He doesn't exist in the same sense that anything other than him exists. But that we've discussed previously. That's not really our focus here. All existence, as we are familiar with it at least, though, in other words, setting aside that idea, all existence with which we're familiar with, from the existence of this table to the existence of the Pythagorean theorem or the abstract idea of freedom, right, or love, or any such thing, everything that we know that exists in Judaism derives its existence from God. Everything comes from and derives from the existence of God. And so the idea that things exist neutrally, in other words, the idea that something can just be without any other context, is an anti-Judaic idea, is not the idea of Judaism. By us, when something exists, God is involved here. There is no just existing. However, because, for reasons we'll discuss later in chapter 36, which at our pace, again, will be in the 50 years from now, but God willing, when we get to chapter 36, as we'll see, that for reasons that are mostly God's alone, he desired to create a reality where it does appear that there are neutral existences. Right? In other words, although it is not really true in the fullest sense of the word, and later in Tanya there's very interesting discussions about the nature of truth, different types of truth, etc. But even though it's not really true, God conceals himself. He hides away the fact that all existence is divine existence. All existence is godly existence. And he creates what one might call in common English, he creates objective reality. Objective reality being what we discussed at length in those two classes, what's more accurately called the external world, the shell reality, right? Because on the inside, there is no such thing as true objective reality. On the inside, everything derives its existence from God. But on the outside, so to speak, superficially, there is a realm where things just exist and interact with each other on those terms. This was originally called the world of the klippos, or the shell reality, and then after the sin of Adam and Eve, eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which is, as we discussed at great length in those two classes, the idea of objective knowledge, the idea of a state where good and evil appear to be equal, rather than good being the godly and evil being the non-godly, and being totally and obviously distinguished one from the other, which is how things were in the Garden of Eden. In the Garden of Eden, evil and good were totally different one from the other, not two different existences, but in fact one reflected existence and one reflected non-existence, because all existence is godly and all non-godly things are non-existing. Yeah, so more different than black and white, because black and white are two things that both exist, right? As different as black and a non-color, you would say, or a non-existing thing, were good and evil. And then with the eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, knowledge, of course, not really being knowledge, the English translation being really insufficient for the term das, which we'll also discuss more later in Tanya. Das really being the capacity of the soul, the capacity of the self to traverse worlds, to unite different realities together, which is why, as we discussed previously, the bar das, the one who attains das, is the age of bar mitzvah in the Gemara. The reason the bar mitzvah is at the age of 13 or 12 for a female is because that's the age where a person attains das, which essentially means das is the maturity to know that the entire reality doesn't revolve around myself. That's really what das is. It's a certain type of what we might call empathy, actually. Although in Chassidus, it's an intellectual function, which is something we'll also get to much later. This is a very quick, we're packing a lot into this review in a short space, if you haven't noticed. But the bottom line is that once Adam and Eve ate from that tree, it affected an existential state, not a moral state, but an existential state. The distinction between them will be more and more important as we go forward. They didn't make a moral state of the mixing of good and evil, because moral states, as the human mind understands them, is a being that exists, choosing to do a destructive thing or a constructive thing, a negative thing or a positive thing, right? What was actually mixed was the existential notion of divine existence and divine non-existence. In other words, we gained the darkness of as the Zohar says, the darkness of this world was pulled over our eyes, was pulled over the eyes of the soul, and we became distant from the true reality, which is that all existence is divine, and we were thrown into a world that's full of klippos, a world that's full of superficial shell realities, where everything is judged according to the objective intellect, where things just exist, especially this table. This table especially, the physical world, is where this is most true of all. Because in the physical world, existence is totally devoid of teichen. It has no inside, right? The Pythagorean theorem exists in a much more real way than a given physical object, which simply exists because it takes up space, because my hand can't go through it. That's why it's here, more or less. That is a very brief summary of the idea of the klippa. And every one of our souls, the Jew's first soul, right? We'll get to the second soul and what it means later. You don't need to worry about that. For now, the only soul that we know about, the essential core of our existence is I am. I exist objectively, right? That's the core of our very existence. And in fact, as we discussed also in those two classes, if we lost this idea of I am, we would in fact be totally destroyed. Our entire soul's purpose is to defend and protect and extend this fundamental vitalizing truth, which is I exist. And this is the spiritual soul that comes from the shell reality, which becomes our soul. So in other words, our souls themselves, this soul, the first soul, does not derive from the place that says only God exists. The first soul derives from the place which says objective reality is reality. Existence is neutral. I'm here. I participate in existence without any context. I simply am. I merely am. Sorry? Maybe Freud was very Hasidic. This is the animal soul we're discussing, yes. This is I don't know how Hasidic Freud was in any other aspect of his life, but maybe in this aspect, something Hasidic slipped in, you never know. We can discuss Freud a different time, tomorrow night. Okay. Then, last week, that was 2 classes ago and 3 classes ago. 1 class ago, last week, we spent the whole class discussing the line in the Tanya which says that this spiritual I am then becomes enclosed in the blood to vivify the body. That's what we discussed last week. And last week's class, the main takeaway was that the physical and the spirit, when we say something is physical in the eyes of Chassidus, we never mean totally non-spiritual. And when we say spiritual, usually the spiritual has a physical aspect. These things are not a strict dichotomy, but on the contrary, these two things build towards each other and meet. And so therefore, how does the spiritual I am, which is more like a concept, right, or an idea, a spiritual reality than a physical one, how does that become the life force of the body? And the answer is because the body has its own spiritual aspect, it has its own, as we would say in Yiddish, its own edel or refined dimension. Particularly, we spent time discussing the heat of the blood. Right? And the spiritual aspect of the body receives the life force of the soul, which is the lowest part of the soul that's able to relate to the body. So the highest of the and most spiritual of the physical and the most physical of the spiritual meet. And we explained that even though they're geared towards each other and the soul has all the right parts for the body, the soul has vision and the body has eyes, and the two of them come together, nevertheless, at the end, at the very, very meeting point, there has to be a bit of divine scotch tape, because ultimately the spiritual and the physical are not identical. The spiritual and physical are not on a spectrum, no matter how physicized or lowly you make the spiritual. And no matter how spiritual you make the physical, to truly get an actual spiritual being, to become one with a physical body and become one being, there needs to be an infinite power of God, which is the keach hamafli lasos, the divine capacity to perform wonders, the wonder of putting a truly spiritual being and a truly physical being and making them into one being. As we discussed last week, that soul and body are not two separate things. A living human being is, the whole human being is soul and body together. And we explained that the soul is not merely like a battery for the body, which is another point that we took away from last week's class. The soul makes the body alive in every aspect, right? The vitality of the soul is not invested in through in a computer, the vitality, or a battery-operated watch, the vitality only comes where the circuits go, but the band of the watch is dead, so to speak, relative to the electric charge in the battery. The whole point of soul and body is that they merge to become absolutely one being. In other words, it's not that you have a dead watch which is temporarily powered by a battery. The body itself becomes alive from the soul. And that's only possible because the two are made to go together. Even though they need God, even though there needs to be an infinite leap to put these two opposites together, the reason they're made for each other in the first place, because we could always ask, if a God needs to, so to speak, by fiat, put them together anyway, so then why would they be constructed or made in such a way that their forms match? And the reason is because we don't just want them to be like two things that are put together, we want them to actually become one thing from the inside, so to speak, such that the body becomes the vessel for the soul, and the soul becomes the light and the vivifying force of the body. That's what we discussed in last week's class. Okay, that was not bad for the review. That was about as quick as it could possibly be. Oh, I should mention, I didn't mention yet in the review, that we mentioned in the first of all these classes, we discussed how because the existence of this animal soul, this first soul, this I am, is not an evil thing, right? It's only evil in an existential sense, because anything that says I am rather than God is evil. Therefore, even as we read in Tanya, it was actually the first thing we read in this whole section, was that even the perfect tzaddik, even the perfectly righteous, have this soul. Because it's not evil, it's not the opposite of righteousness, right? All we mean by evil in this context, or negative in this context, so far anyway, we're about to complicate things slightly, but so far all we mean is existential separation from God. I am instead of God is, right? And you're going to see, I'm hoping, now in these next two classes, why we've spent so much time explaining this word by word and line by line. Because the end of chapter 1 is the hardest part of chapter 1. In other words, now this was all relatively straightforward. Now it actually becomes a little bit trickier, a little bit rougher going in terms of understanding carefully exactly what the Tanya means, because there's some things which are for example, apparently contradictory in what the Alter Rebbe is going to say, and you have to learn carefully to unpack and sort of get at the Rebbe's meaning near the end of Tanya. Thinking if there's anything else I would like to preface. No, we'll discuss it when we read it. So let's read it. We are... For those who have Tanyas, we're going to do a little bit of reading. We have some more, which someone will find and distribute. They are somewhere. We are 4 lines up from the bottom of page 10 in the Hebrew. 4 lines up from the bottom of page 10 in the Hebrew. And we are after footnote 28 in the English. It's the last paragraph on page 4. It says, from its stem, right? After footnote 28 in the English, last paragraph of page 4. From its stem. That's going to be in the English. So let's read a little bit and explain as we go. I have some notes here. Umimena, and from it, meaning from this soul, from this vivifying force of I am as opposed to God is, which encloses within the blood to give life to the body. Umimena ba'is kola midois rois. From it derive all the negative character traits, all the negative emotive traits. From the 4 negative elements Shabbat that are within it, then we are going to go and list all of these 4 negative elements. But before we get to that, we have to explain what is going on. The first point here is that it is from this spiritual I am, this spiritual existential being whose very being is separation from the divine existence, right? From it derive all the negative, I translated character traits, you could also translate emotive traits, that are within the soul. So, One bit at a time. What are midos? Midos we translate as emotive traits or character traits. The truth is that the question is beyond this class. Tanya, there's a whole chapter that we're going to do soon, God willing, on midos, on the nature of the emotive traits. So here we're just going to try and keep it try and keep it light but accurate, so we can move on. Right? What we mean by emotive traits is interesting. The literal translation of midos is dimensions, right, or measures. Right, the measure, like you would say, the midos of the Mishkan is the physical measures, right? This many cubits this way, this many cubits that way are the midos, the measures, right? When it comes to the soul, the midos usually refers to the emotive traits. We know in the Kabbalah, in Chassidus, there's depending how you divide them up, either 6 or 7 emotive traits. You have Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and sometimes Malchus, right? It would be a waste of our time even to translate them right now, because we need much more time and preparation to actually explain what these 6 things are relative to each other. It's not what tonight's class is about. What is a midah? What do we mean by an emotive trait? I would say something like this. The soul has fundamentally 2 types of faculty, as we're going to see. It has 2 types of powers. Essential powers as opposed to superficial ones, all of which are distinctions we will make later, right? But fundamentally, leaving aside all the complications, it has 2 types of powers. We call them intellectual and emotive. The first thing to know is that it's way more complicated than just intellectual and emotive. Even those words can be very misleading, as with most of our translations, as I keep telling you, most of our translations, the English words are the right word or the closest word, but they have way too many connotations that are not really appropriate, and they're missing some of the connotations that are in the Holy Tongue. So it's very, very difficult to translate in one word or even in a few words any of these traits, right? But you have mochen and midos, which we normally translate as intellectual and emotive. I would say the fundamental distinction between intellectual faculties and emotive faculties are as follows. Intellectual faculties are how the soul relates to its own source. Emotive faculties are how the soul relates outward, externally. This is the simplest way I know how to make the distinction. We'll get much more into this later and probably figure out how it's all wrong. The intellectual faculties are how the soul relates to its own source. The emotive faculties are how the soul relates externally, right? Now, I know what you're thinking. I know you're thinking that I can have an emotional relationship with my own source. Doesn't it say to love and fear God in the Torah? And isn't God my source, for example? And I can have an intellectual relationship with things that are outside of me as well. Intellect doesn't seem to be just relating to my source. That my intellect can understand the Pythagorean theorem, and it has nothing to do with apparently with my source. But on the contrary, I would argue, and as we'll discuss more as we go further into Tanya, I would argue that as we are thinking about the Pythagorean theorem, we are in fact making it into our source. We become something that extends from the Pythagorean theorem, or if you prefer, our intellect allows us to become a vessel for, or an extension of, the thing that we understand, more or less. The emotive qualities, on the other hand, even when they're relating to something that's above us, even when they're relating to our source, how do we relate to them? From the outside. We relate to them externally. We relate to them as yet another being, right? And yes, this is related to the distinction between existence as divine existence versus existence as neutral existence. It's very much related, which is why the Alter Rebbe is discussing this right now. The Alter Rebbe does not discuss the intellect that derives from the animal soul, from the I am, from the spiritual I am. He doesn't discuss, which you would think would be the order, because in our order, as we're going to see, it's always intellect qualities first, then emotive qualities, and as the Alter Rebbe is going to discuss, both souls have all the qualities. So in other words, it's not as if the animal soul doesn't have an intellect. On the contrary, the animal soul's intellect is, in a way, the focus of the entire Tanya. It's actually the point of the whole book, in a way. But why? So why does he go immediately to emotions? The answer is because the very nature of being an I am of being a separate existence from God, of being an independent existence, which claims that it exists in a neutral fashion, the very essence of the way it relates to all things is fundamentally emotional. Now, giving the preface of what we mean by intellectual versus emotional, we can now understand what I'm saying, right? The point is not that it's running around screaming and crying or getting angry all day, although some of them do that, and some days, it depends on the day, right? Rather, what we mean is that even when the I am thinks, right, it is only allowed to think in a way that supports the fundamental spiritual core of what it is, which is I am, right? Think about it. Ironic. I'll say it again, and then I'll even explain it for good measure. When this soul, which derives from I am, this soul of Klippa that we're discussing, right? Which is the basis of its existence is independence from God. Independence from God precedes its first thought and its first feeling, much deeper, right? It's the very core of what it is. If it wasn't for independence from God, it would be nothing at all. Yeah? This soul, whose very essence is independence from God, is neutral existence, is I am, it's only allowed to think to the extent that it supports that central principle, which is I am, right? Because if thinking is how one relates to one's source, if thinking allows one to become merely the grounds or the extension of something that is beyond us, if thinking is to relate to higher things, and what we mean by higher is that they become the primary and we become the expression, we become the secondary, which is the true nature of thought. That's the purpose of thought, as we're going to explain later in Tanya. That's what we mean by the intellect, right? And of course, there's distinctions. Chachma is the opposite of Bina. It's all much more complicated than we're saying now. We're saying very, very, like I said, very light and basic, yes, for our purposes. Thinking is the opposite of I am, right? True thinking. But the animal soul thinks, it defends its I am, right? So the answer is that by nature, at least, when it's not compelled, which leads to the question of who might be compelling it and how, seeing as so far we only have one soul. But we'll get to all of that. When it's not compelled by its nature, yes, it only ever thinks things that support the I am, right? The Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Rebbe of Lubavitch, has several beautiful maimarim, which were said primarily. There's two svarim called Kuntresim from the Frierdiker Rebbe called Maimarim Kuntresim, which means literally maimarim and pamphlets. Right? These were discourses that the Frierdiker Rebbe said primarily to simple Jews, which is why they're very, very useful for me, at least. I can't speak for anyone else. They're very, very helpful because they're not so abstract and difficult, right? They're in their own way, they're practical, right? Now, what counts as practical and simple for the Frierdiker Rebbe is very different, right? That itself comes with its own challenges. But relatively speaking, right, it's something that anyone more or less could appreciate to whatever extent. And in several of those maimarim, the Frierdiker Rebbe draws an important distinction between true human thinking and animal thinking. True human thinking is purely abstract, right? You could say, look at this very successful businessman, right? Warren Buffett, great example. Warren Buffett uses his seichel, he uses his intellect to win at the stock market, and he's been doing it for so many years, and he's so successful, right? The Frierdiker Rebbe would say, this is different in extension, but not infinitely different from the intellect that a beaver uses to build its dam, right? Seriously. These are two things on a spectrum. It might be obviously it's a very broad spectrum. What Warren Buffett does may be more complicated than building a dam the way a beaver does it, I'm not sure. But the two things are on a spectrum, right? Why? Because all intellect, which is purely in the service of self-extension, whether self-extension means building my family a home or making lots of money on the stock market, which is different, I agree, and a beaver home is different than a human home. This is all relative, right? It is a spectrum. I'm not trying to reduce one to the other, God forbid, and I don't think neither the Frierdiker Rebbe wasn't either. But the point is that it's all in one category, right? When intellect is self-serving, it's all in one category. Whereas purely abstract intellect which is totally impractical, right? That is intellect that you can trust is actually intellect, right? Why? Because that intellect is not making you the source of anything, it's making you merely the receiver or the grounds for your source, which is what intellect truly is, right? Which is why the Alter Rebbe here, discussing the animal soul, goes immediately to the emotions, right? The animal soul is fundamentally emotive. Again, we don't necessarily mean that every animal soul, the more coarse it is, the more emotional in the simple usage of the term emotional. We don't mean they become more emotional, although to some extent that may also be true, but that's not our intention right now. Our intention right now is to say, when we say it's emotional, we mean that even when it's thinking, right, even when it's using its higher faculties, right, all of those higher faculties ultimately derive from the emotions. They ultimately derive from superficial relation, which is the emotive relationships. How I relate to things outside of me rather than my own source within. How do I relate to something else rather than becoming the vessel and the extension of the thing I'm relating to, right? Which for the animal soul would be self-destruction. Right? If the whole basis of what I am is I am, right? And now I'm saying something else is, and there's no I am at all, right? That would be literally the death of me, the non-existence of me, we should say, right? And that is the last thing that the animal naturally wants. And so the animal is fundamentally emotive, and even when it thinks, even when it uses its mind, it's only with the reshus, it's only with the shtempel, it's with the signing off, the approval of the emotions, of the I am within, right, of the superficial relationships. In other words, yes, I will study this thing, but that study will never lead to my pure, my pure self-abnegation within the idea, my bittul. It will never lead to the total nullification of myself. Pardon?
About the perfect tzaddik.
What about the perfect tzaddik?
The perfect tzaddik has crushed, dissolved, smashed, and effectively done away with his animal soul.
But the perfect tzaddik doesn't think with his animal soul. He thinks with his other soul.
Right. So
we're not talking about the other. We're not talking about the other soul.
No, but my point is, if he has no animal soul,
he has an animal soul. He's just totally subjugated it. It says, we said, even the tzaddik has an animal soul, right? So the question is there any way in which that animal soul expresses itself in the perfect tzaddik? Which is a good question.
He has to eat, right? Like, does he feed himself?
Correct, he feeds himself. He has a biological life, right? You could say. But the thing is that all of the biological desires of the animal soul have been totally subjugated by the godly soul. So in other words, he still has to eat, he still has to use the facilities, right? He still thinks, he still does everything that the biological human being does. But all those biological impulses and desires have been totally transformed at the root into I am not, or rather God is really the core, instead of I am, right? So for example, the tzaddik, when he eats only because there's a divine commandment to eat. Which sounds simpler than it is. It's not so simple. It's actually almost humanly impossible, which is why true tzaddikim are so rare, right?
So he has no
present company excluded.
So he has no desire for food at all.
He desires,
Based on
he desires the food, but as a commandment of God, we would say. Correct.
There's no pleasure derived.
Correct. The only pleasure is fulfilling the divine commandment thereby, right? So it's a question of how much the food even remains food. It's food and it's hunger, but it's totally transformed in the first place, and not just morally, which Tanya would say is that's the easy part, right? Don't what's it called? It's a mitzvah. Don't gorge yourself, I believe is the way it's normally translated, right? Don't gorge yourself, don't be a glutton, right? The Alter Rebbe would say, oh, that's simple, right? That's even an animal could learn not to be a glutton, right? The tricky part is that the eating should not be I am, the eating should be God is. That's the hard part, right? In other words, it's not a moral transformation. A moral transformation is you shouldn't eat immorally. That's the superficial level. Right? That doesn't make a person a tzaddik, as we're going to learn eventually when we get to chapter 13, only 3 years from now. But on the contrary, the tzaddik has to totally transform from the root that idea. So, the Alter Rebbe begins to talk about emotive qualities and negative emotive qualities, because all the negative emotive qualities, which is again the soul's way of relating to things outside of itself, right? Rather than its source, rather than becoming an expression of something else, right? Which in fact you'll notice is what we normally think of as just relating to something in general, which shows you how much of our life is emotive rather than intellectual as I'm describing it, because very rarely do we consider ourselves to be merely the expression of a source. So this just goes to show that it seems to be the only way of relating we're familiar with, just goes to show that the Alter Rebbe is right in what he's talking about. But this is the source. This I am is the source of all negative ways of relating to other things. Now, this is where things become slightly more complicated, and the complications will only build from this point on. So we have to, as we say in yeshiva, we have to halt kop, which literally means you have to hold the head, which is not good, not useful advice in English, but it means you have to pay attention, right? You have to, because the way, there is a way through the thicket, but you have to know all the turns, right? You have to know how you have to follow how we got there. Yeah. The key confusion here is that when the Alter Rebbe says good and evil, right? There's multiple things that good and evil mean. That's really the core of the whole confusion with the end of chapter 1 of Tanya. The whole core of it is that when we say good and evil, there's multiple things these terms can mean, right? We are saying like this: there is something called I am, which is existential evil. That I am is the source of the evil or negative character traits, by which we mean evil in the more conventional sense, right? Morally evil. Because as we are going to see very shortly, and that's where you would have gotten confused, so I'm just preventing your imminent confusion, right? As we are going to see shortly, there are also good character traits that derive from the I am. And you would say, but how can a good thing derive from it if it's I am, if it's existentially evil? And the answer is because we're saying something more subtle. Existential I am is the source of moral evil. Moral evil in terms of personality, the way our soul fundamentally relates to other things. That's what the Alter Rebbe is going to enumerate and explain. The existential I am is the root of the moral evil. The evil of I'm separate from God is the root of what we normally call evil, which is immoral, selfish, or destructive behavior, right? The reason for this is fairly straightforward, but let's say it just to make sure we understand it. If an individual does not live as I am, but rather lives as God is, there is no impetus to doing moral evil. I'll say it again. If the person lives not as I am, but only as God is, there is no impetus to moral evil in several dimensions. First of all, I don't make my own decisions about my own life to a large extent, in moral questions anyway. In those questions, I only express the divine will because all that exists is God. I don't have my own existence. I'm not a private citizen, right? I exist only to express my source. I'm not a person. I'm a vessel, right? I convey. the divine. Furthermore, at a more coarse and psychological level, right, as Chassidus explains elsewhere, all evil, or at least pretty much all moral evil, especially when it comes to relating to other people, but when you relate to the divine as well, it's true, right? All moral evil is a side effect, in a sense, of defending this I am against other I ams, right? The I am, the animal soul, is fundamentally insecure, we would say in modern parlance. Why is it insecure? Because the truth is, Chassidus would say, it actually should be insecure because its whole existence is based on a lie, right? It has to defend the I am, which is not really true except to the extent that you make it true, right? It's not really real. It doesn't derive from some higher place, right? It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? It's like saying, I take up space because I clear the space around myself. Well, if that's what it means to take up space, then you're going to be doing a lot of hard work, right? Because you have to constantly defend and protect that space. Even if you're a very refined and morally good and relatively selfless in the moral sense individual, right? There are limits to how selfless you can be and still defend the I am, right? And in fact, by understanding this, by the way, with this understanding of the difference between existential I am and moral I am, and how the two things are moral evil, and how the two things are connected, how they're connected but different, right? With this, this alone allows a person to understand many things in the Torah in a whole new light, right? For example, if you don't have this paradigm, if you don't understand this idea of the existential I am, you will not understand at all, which I know for a fact because I've seen many, many terrible, poor, impoverished interpretations. You will not understand at all the story of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac in the Chumash, the entire and why it's such a big deal in Judaism, right? Which is a longer discussion for a different time. I think we've spoken about it in this class on multiple occasions. But the bottom line is that the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, is so significant in Judaism because it is the first time a human being ever attained the pure state of God is rather than I am, right? Which was only achievable by Abraham vanquishing his intellectual understanding of God, which still came from I am. It's a very deep thing, which we cannot explain at length at this time. I'm just pointing out to you, for those who remember the explanation that we discussed on previous times, right, or those who want to investigate it further, this understanding is extremely helpful in illuminating very difficult or hard to understand things in the Torah. There is a difference between moral goodness, so to speak, being a good person, quote unquote, and being divine, which is really what the major focus of Judaism. Judaism is not really about being a good person, it's about being divine, and you see this reflected in so much of Chassidus, so much of the Tanya, so many discourses, so many of the teachings of the Rebbeim, all derive from this fundamental fact that it's not about being a good person in the worldly understanding of that term. It's about being divine. It's about being godly, although the two things are related. Yes, the negative character traits, the selfish and destructive character traits, emotions, which we use to relate to things outside of us, right? That negativity all derives from this fundamental spiritual I am. Yes? Let's pause for questions briefly, and then we'll go on to the four elements. It's our next topic.
So this is where Bittul allows you to set yourself aside and focus totally on God.
Yes, in Chassidus, that's the bittul we're looking for, and the bittul is really a function of the godly soul, which this understanding also helps us appreciate why, so to speak, there needs to be a godly soul, quote unquote, which is a coarse way of thinking about it, but there needs to be a godly soul because you can't really bootstrap yourself out of being a yesh, out of being an I am. Anything that you do, as we said, even the highest and loftiest and most abstract things, right, really all derive ultimately from that shtempel, from that hechsher of I am. The I am gives you permission to do all of these things. The only way to escape is with the power of the spark of God, which is given to us, right? Yes?
So this animal soul, the I am, if you said a couple times it's a lie, like it's defending this.
Yeah.
It's not actually true.
Yeah.
And so I'm getting the impression that it's either if that was to be proved, like if that lie came, like it's not true. Is it still from God, or does it actually cease to exist ultimately? Is it an illusion, like not real in general? Like the shell is another way of saying the shell, as if it's just not real.
It's a very, very good question, and in fact, I was wondering if someone would ask it even as I was saying it, because I have an awareness of when I'm complicating matters myself. It's a very good question, though.
I come from a perspective where like this is all an illusion, right?
Right. So I don't know if we would be so radical as to say it's all an illusion. What we mean by a lie is, in this case, right? This is only, I don't know if this is going to be a satisfying answer. What we mean by a lie in this case is really against the ultimate will of God. So in other words, to an extent, God wills things that are not absolutely true to exist for a time. In other words. So it comes from God, right? And it's not a lie in the sense that we are creating it. It's a reality that comes from God, and even in the perfect tzaddik still exists, right? It's a biological life force. It's where life is. It comes from God, yes. But when we say it's a lie, we mean it's not in alignment with His ultimate will. That's really what we mean in this case.
So like on the level that God exists beyond, because you were talking about even God is beyond
existence. Yes.
Does that still come from His beyond existence, and does that return eventually?
It's a very profound question. I think, that's another thing that deserves much more time, and I'm only going to give very short. But the answer is, on one foot, that the Alter Rebbe himself writes the 20th chapter of Igeres HaKodesh, which is the 20th chapter of the fourth part of Tanya, which was not even on the schedule for this class, even 30 years from now. This is on part 1 of Tanya only. We're at chapter 53. At the end of chapter 53, we stop. If you're still around, you'll get your money back. God willing. I don't know if I'll still be around. The idea is, the Alter Rebbe writes there, and in fact, it's one of the most profound and one of the most cited chapters in the whole Tanya in all of Hasidic teaching. It's very difficult to understand. It's very profound. And it was actually the last thing, more or less, that the Alter Rebbe wrote. It was actually found in his pocket when he passed away. So in that chapter, the Alter Rebbe writes that the secret is, part of why it's so important that there should be an I am as opposed to a God is because the only other I am that there is literally God himself, right? The difference is that when he says it, it's absolutely and infinitely true. And when we say it, it's not really true in the same way. When we say it, it's kind of like a lie or it's conditional. But nevertheless, that we should even think in our physical reality that things simply exist because they exist could not derive from anywhere other than the true one who exists because he exists, which is God. So in other words, despite the fact that we're painting this as a very lowly and false thing, in Chassidus you often find, and in the Alter Rebbe you often find this incredible penchant for reversals, for the transformation of the lowest into the highest, that the lowest ultimately derives from the highest place. And the fact is that the reason we're here in this physical reality is the job we have to do here, the reason why this exists and why we're here, is because there is something very profound in the I am of the physical universe, the multiple I am, the infinite I ams of the physical universe, right, that exists nowhere else in between us and God, except in God himself. In other words, nothing in between, no angel, no divine emanation, not the infinite light of God, as discussed in Chassidus, not the tzimtzum, not the primordial man, all the different levels and emanations and divine creations that come forth from God, nothing in between this physical reality and God shares these two things in common. So in other words, God has transposed, he sent down his I am into the lowest possible place as a separate I am, right? He took his I am and made a mirror image of it, so to speak, in physical reality, which is why our reality is very significant, even though in Chassidus we say there are infinite realities, right? Ours is important in a way because of this reason. It's why we're at the bottom, and it's also why, as we say, Seif Maisa b'machshava tchila, right? As we say, not tchilasan b'seifan, the end of the action is at the beginning of thought, right? When the person builds a house, the first thing they imagine is the finished product, right? Then they have to think about where am I going to go get bricks and where am I going to go get timber, right? And all the other steps and how am I going to build it, and I have to hire workers and a contractor and all the other steps in the way. And then in the end, what do they get? The thing that they imagined right at the beginning, right? It's the same with our reality. Our reality is the lowest, but guess what? The reason it's the lowest is because it's the finished product. It's the original thing that God desired. So there is something here, to answer your question very briefly, there is something here we're oversimplifying. When we say that the I am of this reality is a lie, in one sense it is, in another sense it's on the contrary, it's the deepest truth that must be freed, etc., for a different time, God willing. The four elements, let's discuss briefly. The Alter Rebbe says that the negative character traits come from the Daled Chassidus, the four elements of which this soul of Klippa is made, right? Four elements. When we say elements, we mean basic building blocks of which things are built. We don't mean things that are themselves indivisible, right? The Rebbe actually says in a letter that it's similar to the language in English when you talk about elements of society, right? Just because Daryl is an element of society doesn't mean we can't cut him up into smaller pieces, right? Similarly, when we say the four elements are elements, we don't mean that you can't subdivide them further. We mean that these are basic level composites, spiritual composites, of which all things are made. Chassidus makes much use of the four elements. The four elements are very common, especially in the ancient world. We have them in Judaism, but almost everyone else has them in some form or other. The four elements are in descending order. You'll notice that the Alter Rebbe has them out of order, and I forgot the reason why. I'll go and look it up, and we'll maybe put it in next week's class, God willing. But the descending order is fire, air, water, and earth, right? Some believe, and the Rebbe is vehemently against this idea, that the four elements derive from a non-Jewish source. The four elements are codified by the Rambam in Mishnah Torah. They're part of Jewish law, the same way that Mashiach is. The Rabbi was talking about between Mincha and Mariv, right? They're part of the Jewish code of law, and the Rebbe was emphatic that anything that's in the Jewish code of law has Jewish sources known to Maimonides. And in fact, it's not very hard to find the four elements. I think I've mentioned this in this class as well previously. But in fact, all four elements are found in the first two verses of the Torah. Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'es haaretz. You have aretz, you have earth, right? Va'aretz ha'isa, you actually have va'aretz just in the second verse. Va'aretz ha'isa soyu v'vayu, right? The earth again was chaos and the void. V'cheshech al pnei ha'tohem, darkness was on the face of the deep. V'ruach Elokim, ruach meaning spirit or air, right? Merachevas al pnei hamayim, I think. Pnei hamayim. When the Spirit of God was hovering on the face of the water, right? So there's water, air, and earth, all in the second verse, right? Where do you see fire? So there's disagreement. Some sources say that the fire is when God says, let there be light. And light is fire, right? And in Rabbinic Hebrew, means fire just as much as it means light, right? Let there be light, let there be fire. Other opinions, like it says in the Zohar, say, intriguingly, that the fire is the cheshech al pnei ha'tohim, is the darkness on the face of the deep, that the fire is actually darkness. And you go figure it out. There's a whole Kabbalistic explanation. There's a whole Kabbalistic explanation, not for now. Yeah, the black fire, yes, the Betina de Cardenisa. We have all the Kabbalists in the class. We all know the dark fire, the black flame, whatever this means, for a different time. So you have the four elements. So why is the Alter Rebbe talking about the four elements? Because what he's going to say, we'll read it in a moment, what he's going to say is all the negative character traits that derive from each element, right? All the ways that I am expresses itself negatively from the four spiritual elements that comprise it, right? The question is, why doesn't the Alter Rebbe just list the negative character traits, right? He's going to say that arrogance comes from anger and pleasure-seeking comes from water. So why not just say that the animal soul has arrogance and pleasure-seeking? Why the connection to the elements, right? And the answer seems to be, from what I could find, the answer seems to be that the emphasis here again, from the Alter Rebbe, is that this is about the actual stuff of which the soul is made. In other words, the whole emphasis is that the negative character traits are not just modes of behavior, they're grounded in the very stuff that the soul is made of. That's the point, right? In other words, the Alter Rebbe is drawing the connection between the I am and the arrogance, pleasure-seeking, etc., right? It's not that these things are just negative behavior traits that the soul happens to have. It's the very stuff that it's made of compels it to relate in this way. Because it is I am, and I am made out of these four spiritual elements put together, right? The truth is, I could speak much longer about the four elements. I find them absolutely fascinating. We'll leave it here. These four elements, of which the soul is comprised, right? These four elements give it these emotive qualities, right? So it derives from what the soul is, not just what the soul does. Let's read it. The Hainu, 3 lines up from the bottom of the page. The Hainu, kas v'gaiva miyusay da'esh shenig b'lamayla. You have anger and arrogance that come from the element of fire, because the element of fire constantly raises itself higher. Fire ascends, right? The Alter Rebbe does not mean this only in the physical sense. He means it in the most profound sense imaginable. When you understand the elements as spiritual qualities, you will see, as explained at great length elsewhere in Chassidus, you will see that the entire essence of fire is described by the fact that it ascends above, which also is connected to the fact that the Zohar calls the fire dark, just by the way. The taivas hatanugim miyosod hamayim. The desire for pleasure comes from the element of water. Ki hamayim matzmichim kol minei tainug. Why? Because water grows and causes to grow all manners of pleasure. Please don't ask me too much what that means exactly. I know what it means at the simple level. Beyond the simple level, I'm frankly not so clear on it. I need to brush up, because at the simple level, all things from which we take pleasure essentially derive from water one way or another, right? I don't really know much more beyond that, what this means, which I'm happy to admit, because for those who have been here since the beginning of these Tanya classes, you know that I prefaced the whole thing with saying that I don't understand Tanya. So that was your general disclaimer, and now we have some specific disclaimers. The Hilulus v'leit sanus v'es pyros, and I'll use the translation here, it will help. Frivolity, scoffing, boasting, v'dvarim betelim, and idle talk, miyosod haruach, come from the element of air. Again, the elements here are in the wrong order, and again, I forget why. There's a reason why. I forget the reason why. He goes from fire to water, and then to air, and then to earth, which is the wrong, or the shouldn't say wrong, the non-traditional order. The traditional from highest to lowest is fire, air, water, and then earth. It's a different order the Alter Rebbe uses here. Interestingly, when he says, just a note, he says boasting, right, his pyrus, comes from air, but we said already that arrogance comes from fire. And you would think boasting and arrogance sound very similar one to the other. And the commentaries say that the arrogance which comes from fire is arrogance with a basis in the truth. Whereas boasting, like air, the whole idea of air is it's empty. right? Air, idle talk, we even say in English, hot air, right? Person's full of hot air, there's no substantiality to it. There's a big difference between boastfulness that's just to boast with no substantiality versus arrogance, which is like fire. It's arrogance, which is the person has something to that trait, but they allow it to lift them up above others, right? Look down on others. That I am comes to the fore in that sense. And then finally, atzvus va'atzvus meyesed ha'afar. You have sloth and sadness derived from the element of earth, which earth, of course, being the heaviest, the coarsest, and the lowest of the elements. So you have the things that are associated with heaviness, lack of vitality. The Hasidic masters would say that sadness is tantamount to death, right? It's the earth that's within the soul. And we know in Chassidus the great emphasis that's placed on not being sad, right? And in fact, not being sad and having energy, not being sad and not being slothful in Chassidus are deeply related one to one another, because the opposite of both is vitality, right? Is liveliness, is say again? Joy, right? We'll leave it for now. Okay, let's go a little further. We are over time, but we ask for your permission to go a little over. Because if we don't do these together, then it's much worse. We should do these two things together. V'gam midos teves. Now I'm at the top of page Vav. The second chapter is in sight, so close yet so far. V'gam midos teves shebeteva kol Yisrael b'toldeisam kamei rachmanos ugmos chasadim bas mimena. And even the good or positive character traits that are in the nature of every Jew, betoldesam, as an inheritance, so to speak. We might say in modern English, genetically. They say the innate nature of all of Israel, makes sense. Kamai, what are innate natures of Israel, of Jews? Kamai, rachmanus v'gemlei chasadim, like mercy, and gemlei chasadim is acts of kindness to others, like charitableness, you might say, right? Magnanimity, perhaps. These are traits. Where does this come from? This is not an invention of the Alter Rebbe. This comes from the Gemara in Yevamos, a very, very famous piece of Talmud, which says that the inherent character traits of the Jewish people, which is not to say that those character traits can't be contradicted or that every Jew expresses these character traits, etc. But by nature, the Talmud seems to believe that there is such a thing as a national character, which is literally passed on from parent to child as a collective. The Talmud believes in such things, right? And we say that the Jewish people, from all our years of being Jews, going all the way back to our founding patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who we'll discuss more in chapter 2 in connection with the godly soul, right? The Jewish animal soul also has positive character traits, right? The positive character traits being the ones listed in the Gemara, for example, right, which are mercy. All of these things could deserve their own class, by the way, defining what these words mean. Mercy, gemei chasadim, which is kindness unto others. And the Gemara actually says a third that the Alter Rebbe doesn't quote, interestingly, which is baishanim, which means they are bashful. You know why the Alter Rebbe doesn't quote it? Because the Maharsha, commenting on the Gemara over there, says that in fact, we see with our own eyes that Jews are not bashful. On the contrary, Jews are known for their chutzpah, the exact opposite. Jews are not bashful at all. Jews are, on the contrary, loudmouths, bold, and will say things that need to be said, etc., etc. They are not so bashful. So why does the Talmud there say that Jews are bashful? Because even though it's not their inherent nature, the giving of the Torah, says the Maharsha, was a nationally humbling experience, which humbled and broke to some extent, apparently, the chutzpah of the Jew, whatever that means. But the Alter Rebbe does not mention this here as an inherent trait, so apparently the Alter Rebbe agrees as well that this is not an inherited trait, so to speak, of the Jewish people. These positive traits derive from the animal soul. Now I've set it up so we can understand what this means now. We're not going to be confused, right? Remember, I mentioned these earlier. I said it's going to be confusing because you have the I am, which is in a way the root of all evil is I am. It's the existential separation from God. It's rather than admitting that God is the only reality, it is our baseline of existence which says, I exist, I am. But from this I am, derive also positive traits of the Jewish character, right? Good things. How is that possible? How is that possible? We'll end with it. We'll end with saying why it's possible, and God willing, next class we'll expand more on why this is so. Ki b'Yisrael nefesh zu de klipa hi miklipas nega, because in Jews, this animal soul, this I am, derives from a particular type of klipa, a particular type of shell reality called klipas nega, which literally means a translucent shell. That the I am has some translucence to it. It allows the light through. Right? It allows light to pass through it, whatever that means. We'll discuss more next week. Sheyesh bagam kem tev, that it has also good within it. V'hu mesoid etz hadas tov v'ra. It derives from the spiritual secret of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. What this means, gentlemen, I'll tell you in short what it means, and then next class we'll go into this much more and continue, God willing, with the end of chapter 1. What this means is that the Jewish soul, even though this soul that we're describing is fundamentally selfish, nevertheless, that selfishness expresses sometimes as positive character traits inherently, right? In other words, the Alter Rebbe is saying, the Jewish people as a national character have a certain knack for certain positive things, positive traits by nature. And what we mean by positive is not that they are the opposite of I am, right? Rather, we mean I am not only for myself. I am is the basis. It all still starts from I am. We're not talking about selflessness. We're not talking about reflecting the divine reality existentially. We mean that some things which we would consider morally good, less self-serving, right, also derive from this existential separation from Hashem as a national character trait, right? The way I was thinking about it when I was preparing this class, and God willing we'll talk about this more next week, is you could say that in the Jewish national character, there are certain things that shine through which are more of an am than an I. In the I am, right? When I say I exist, they're more of an exist than an I, right? In other words, there is something of that neutral, objective reality, which we said come from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which allows good and evil to be equal, right? If it allows good and evil to be equal in its perspective, then sometimes you can choose good, sometimes you can do moral good, even if the basis of it is existential separation from God. So the takeaway from this last part is, and which we'll build on in next week's class, God willing, is that the Jew, despite being separate from godliness and having I exist as the center of his animal existence, that I exist, there is still certain positive, morally positive, national character traits, self-serving ones, which serve to reinforce the Jewish I exist, right? The Jewish selfishness can be a source of certain positive character traits because their klipa, their shell reality, their I exist, derives from a translucent shell, a shell that lets the light through, which is something we will discuss more, God willing, next week.
Right.